The first thing I noticed was her hand. Steady, practiced, tilting a small glass vial over the rim of my champagne flute like she'd done it 100 times before and knew exactly how many seconds it would take. I was 11 feet away, crossing the reception tent to fix a place card that had blown sideways off an easel, when I caught the movement in the beveled mirror behind the dessert table. My brand new mother-in-law, Margot Sterling, stood with her back half-turned to the room, one hand fussing with a centerpiece of white ranunculus, the other tipping something clear and thin into my glass, unhurried, the way you do something you've rehearsed in your head so many times your body doesn't need your attention anymore. She capped the vial without looking down at it. She tucked it into her clutch. She smoothed the tablecloth with 2 fingers, turned, and accepted a compliment on the flowers from a passing guest, without missing a single beat of warmth in her voice. She never saw me at the edge of the tent, half hidden by a column wrapped in trailing jasmine. I stood very still and counted 4 seconds in my head, the way I count seconds at a scene when I need my hands to stop shaking before I write anything down. Then I walked to the sweetheart table like I was only straightening the linens, picked up both flutes in one smooth motion, and switched them. Her glass went into my seat. My glass went into hers. I set them down in the exact spot they'd been, matched the angle of the stems to the angle they were in before, and folded my hands in my lap like nothing in the world had happened at all. My hands were steady. I've had a great deal of practice with steady. I investigate insurance fraud for a living, the kind where people fake falls down staircases, stage kitchen fires for the payout, and more than you would ever want to believe, quietly drug their own relatives to make an accident look believable later, once the story needs to hold up under a claims adjuster's questions. Switching 2 champagne glasses at my own wedding was, honestly, one of the easiest things. I did that entire week. But the sedative sitting in that flute was the smallest thing Margot Sterling was hiding from me that night. What I already had sitting in a case folder back at my office, 2 weeks old and growing heavier by the day, made that little glass vial look like a party favor. And in about 90 minutes, in front of 200 wedding guests under a tent full of string lights, she was going to find that out for herself, in the worst possible way, in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. Welcome back to Paper Trail Justice. I'm Delia Marsh, 33 years old, a Special Investigations Unit fraud investigator out of Savannah, Georgia. This is the story of the night my mother-in-law tried to drug me at my own wedding to stop a single piece of paper from getting signed, and how that paper got signed anyway. Along with everything else in her life, she never wanted anyone to read. If you've ever had someone smile at you across a table while quietly working against you underneath it the whole time, stay with me, because the ending is worth every minute. Drop a comment and type the word receipts if you've ever kept proof of something because some quiet part of you had a feeling you'd need it one day. And if stories like this one keep you company in the evenings, go ahead and subscribe, because there is a lot more paper trail where this one came from, and I intend to keep pulling it. Let me back up though, because you need to understand what I do for a living before you'll fully understand what I saw in that mirror, and why I already had a name circled in red on a case file before I ever touched a single champagne glass. I grew up outside Statesboro, Georgia, in a rented shotgun house with my grandmother, Odette Marsh, after my parents split for good when I was 8 and neither of them stuck around long enough afterward to argue over custody. Odette worked the register at a hardware store on Main Street for 31 years and raised me on grits, gospel radio on Sunday mornings, and one piece of advice she repeated so often it might as well have been carved into the frame over our front door. Always keep your receipts, baby. Not because you don't trust people, because people forget what they promised the second it's inconvenient to remember it, and paper doesn't forget anything, ever, no matter how badly somebody wishes it would. She meant it literally at first. A cardboard shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet, stuffed with receipts, warranty cards, and canceled checks that saved us more than once over the years. I remember the landlord who tried to claim we'd never paid March rent, standing on our porch with his hands on his hips, and I remember Odette walking back inside without a word and returning with a single yellowed receipt, dated, signed, and that was the entire conversation, over before it had really started. I remember a mechanic who tried to bill us twice for the same transmission repair, and how Odette laid 2 invoices side by side on his own counter and just waited, arms crossed, until he apologized. I used to watch grown men go quiet in a hardware store parking lot because a woman half their size had a piece of paper they hadn't expected her to have kept. There's one memory that stuck with me harder than the rest. I was 12, and a man who did odd jobs around the neighborhood offered to fix our leaning back fence for $40, took the money up front, and never came back. Odette didn't yell. She didn't even seem angry. She just wrote the date, the amount, and his name in a little spiral notebook she kept by the phone, and when I asked her what good that would do since he was already gone, she told me something I didn't understand until years later. It doesn't do any good today, baby. It does good the next time somebody tries to tell you it never happened. The paper isn't for winning today's fight. It's for winning the fight you don't even know is coming yet. By the time I got to college studying criminal justice, I didn't want to be a police officer, and I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be the person with the shoebox. I found my way into insurance investigations almost by accident, through an internship at a regional carrier the summer after my sophomore year, and I never left. 6 years in by the time this story starts, I was working major case fraud, staged car wrecks with suspiciously convenient witnesses, disability claims from people photographed water skiing on their supposedly ruined knee, arson for profit on buildings that had conveniently lost their tenants right before the fire, and life insurance beneficiaries who couldn't quite explain, when you actually asked them plainly, why they'd taken out a policy on someone 11 days before that someone died. I learned to read a room the way my grandmother read a receipt. People lie constantly with their mouths, fluently, sometimes even to themselves. They very rarely lie convincingly with paper, because paper has a way of outliving the story that was built to explain it away. I met Grant Sterling at a hurricane relief fundraiser 2 years before this wedding. Of all the ordinary places two people can meet, both of us standing in a long, slow line for the same terrible coffee at a folding table under a banner that was slightly too small for the words printed on it. He ran restoration projects for his family's company, Sterling Restoration and Roofing, out of downtown Savannah. The kind of outfit that gets called when a 200-year-old house on one of the historic squares starts shedding its roof slates, or its porch columns start rotting from the inside out, where nobody can see it until the whole thing sags. He talked about 100-year-old heart pine, the way other men talk about their favorite sports team, with actual reverence in his voice. And he was patient in a way I genuinely wasn't used to, the kind of patience that comes from spending your entire working life putting broken things back together slowly, on purpose, one board at a time, instead of tearing them down fast, because fast is easier. He didn't mention that his family's company was worth anything in particular, that first conversation or the 10 after it. I didn't ask. I think that omission, on both our parts, tells you something honest about who we both were before any of this started. Sterling Restoration and Roofing was Grant's grandfather's company before it was ever his mother's. Ambrose Sterling started it in 1961 with one aluminum ladder, a used truck, and a reputation for never leaving a job half-finished even if it cost him money to finish it right. And over 4 decades, he built it into the outfit that half of historic Savannah calls when their roofline is 140 years old, and their insurance carrier wants documented proof of the repair before they'll even discuss renewing the policy. Ambrose's son, Walton Sterling, everyone in that family called him Walt, took the company over in his early 30s and ran it for 20 years with Margot at his side handling the front office, the invoicing, the client relationships. Everything Walt himself was too busy climbing scaffolding to manage. Grant grew up on job sites the way some kids grow up on a boat or a working farm, climbing scaffolding before he could ride a bike without training wheels, learning to sound out rot in a joist by knocking on it with his knuckles before he could properly read. Walt died 6 years ago, before I ever met Grant. He fell from a scaffold restoring the cupola of an old cotton exchange building downtown, a 4-story fall onto a loading dock, and it was ruled an accident within a week. Nobody in the family ever told the story any other way. I had no reason at the time, hearing it secondhand and months into dating their son, to ask a single question about it. After Walt died, Margot took over as majority owner and sole trustee of the company, which by then was worth several $1 million in equipment, contracts, and 2 decades of hard-earned goodwill across the historic district. Grant worked under her, running crews, learning the craft the way his father and grandfather had before him, climbing the same kind of scaffolding his father had fallen from without ever once mentioning that it bothered him to do it. He never complained to me about his mother running things. He loved the work itself too much to resent the arrangement. He just never seemed to have his hands fully on the wheel of his own family's company, and it took me a long time to understand why, mostly because Grant himself didn't fully understand it either. Here's the part I only learned 2 months before the wedding, when Grant's Aunt Corinne, Walt's older sister, 81 years old, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued than most defense attorneys I've cross-examined on a witness stand, handed me a thick manila envelope over sweet tea on her screened porch, and said, "You're marrying into paper, honey, whether you know it yet or not. You should probably read some of it first." Inside was a certified copy of Walt Sterling's will and the accompanying trust documents. Walt had quietly restructured the company's ownership 18 months before he died, and buried in dense, deliberate trust language on page 11 was one very specific clause that Corinne had underlined in pencil years earlier and never erased. Full operational control and equal trusteeship of Sterling Restoration and Roofing would pass to Grant only upon his marriage, with his spouse named, by name of role rather than name of person, as co-trustee alongside him, holding independent audit rights over the company's complete books and records from the day the marriage certificate was legally filed with the county. Corinne watched my face while I read that clause twice. Walt didn't trust his own wife with the ledger by herself, she said, plain as anything, rocking her chair with one slippered foot like she was only discussing the weather. He never told me why, not outright, not in so many words. But he told me once, about a year before he died, that he'd started keeping what he called a second set of eyes on the invoices. Those were his exact words to me, sitting right there where you're sitting now, a second set of eyes. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, what had happened to those eyes. She looked at me for a long, quiet moment, long enough that I could hear the porch fan ticking, and said, "He died before he finished looking, sweetheart. And nobody in this family has ever finished looking for him." I asked her one more thing before I left that afternoon, whether she and Margot had always gotten along. Corinne laughed, short and dry, and said, "Margot has sent me a birthday card every single year for 19 years, honey. I'll let you decide for yourself what that means once you've been in this family a little longer." I didn't say anything to Grant about any of it that day. I filed it, mentally, and, admittedly, in an actual physical folder in my own home office, the way I file everything that doesn't add up cleanly yet. Not because I suspected my future mother-in-law of anything specific, because that is simply what I do with information that doesn't sit right. I keep it until it either resolves on its own or it doesn't. The wedding was set for the third Saturday in October at Belhaven Gardens, an old estate on the edge of the historic district with live oaks dragging Spanish moss low enough to brush your shoulder, and a reception tent large enough for 200 guests under a canopy of string lights. Margot planned nearly all of it herself, insisted on it, in fact, the way some mothers insist on controlling a wedding, as the very last thing they still feel entitled to control about their grown children. She was, on the surface, warm to me the entire engagement, complimented my dress at every single fitting, down to the beading on the sleeve, told the caterer my favorite foods without asking me directly and got most of them right, which unsettled me more than it should have. Introduced me to her friends as her son's very impressive fiancé, the one who catches liars for a living, always said with a small, bright laugh that landed a half-second too sharp to be entirely a joke. There was a moment at my final dress fitting, 3 weeks before the wedding, that I filed away too. Margot sat in the corner of the boutique, watching the seamstress pin my hem, and said, almost idly, that she hoped I wasn't planning to keep working after the wedding, that Grant's father always preferred a wife who understood a family's business was family, not a job for outsiders to poke through. I told her, just as lightly, that I had no intention of ever stopping. She smiled at me in the fitting mirror and said, "Well, we'll see what marriage teaches you." I smiled back and didn't answer, because some conversations aren't worth winning in a dressing room. The rehearsal dinner was where I first felt the ground genuinely tilt. 40 of us at a long table at a restaurant on the river, candlelight, everyone loose and happy on good wine. Grant's cousin Wes leaned over at one point and told me, half joking, that Denise Cobb, the family's longtime bookkeeper, seated 2 chairs down, who'd apparently been at every Sterling family gathering for as long as he could remember, kept the whole company running behind the scenes, and that Margot trusted her more than she trusted most of her own relatives. I filed that too, without knowing yet exactly why it mattered. Margot stood to give a toast partway through dinner, and with her glass raised and her voice honey-smooth, she looked right at me and said, "Grant has always brought home strays who needed fixing. I suppose this time he found one who fixes other people instead. Isn't that refreshing?" The table laughed because it was delivered exactly like a joke, the way cruelty so often is delivered at those tables, wrapped in just enough warmth that objecting to it would make you the difficult one. Grant squeezed my hand under the tablecloth, already halfway to an apology he didn't need to give. I laughed along with everyone else, because that's a skill too, keeping your face soft while you're quietly taking inventory of exactly what just happened. Later that night, back at Grant's apartment, I told him what his aunt had shown me. Not to accuse anyone of anything yet, just to ask what he actually knew. He knew almost nothing: that his father had died on a job site, that his mother had run the company competently enough in the years since, that the paperwork around the trust was, in his own words, boring lawyer stuff he'd never bothered reading closely because he trusted his own mother to have handled it fairly. I asked him one question. Has anyone at the company ever mentioned a vendor called Coastal Sterling Supply? He said the name sounded vaguely familiar, maybe a materials subcontractor. He wasn't sure and asked why I was asking. I told him it might be nothing. I already suspected it wasn't nothing because I'd seen that exact name 11 months earlier on a case file that had crossed my own desk at work and then quietly closed for reasons that never once sat right with me. Here's where I have to tell you about the case file itself, because it's the reason none of what happened at that wedding was random. And it's the reason I already had a folder with Margot Sterling's name circled in red pen before I ever swapped a single champagne glass on that tablecloth. A year before I met Grant, my unit investigated a workers' compensation claim tied to a construction company operating under a name I didn't recognize at the time: Coastal Sterling Supply, LLC, a materials and labor subcontractor that had billed a client's insurance carrier for a scaffolding-related injury settlement. Something about the invoices bothered me from the very first pass. The delivery dates didn't line up with any freight manifests I could pull. The site address matched a residential lot that, according to public permit records, had never had a single permit filed for the type of work being billed for months at a time. I flagged the file for deeper review and started building a timeline. Before I could finish that timeline, the file was reassigned to another investigator on my team and closed within 3 weeks, formally marked insufficient evidence to pursue. That happens sometimes for entirely legitimate reasons. This particular time it happened right after a very polite, very brief phone call from a very well-connected attorney representing the client, and it happened right before my supervisor at the time, a man named Cal Whitfield, who has since retired, quietly told me over coffee to let it go, that the underlying construction company was well respected in the community and we didn't need the headache this close to budget season. I let it go, professionally, the way you have to when a supervisor closes a file over your objection and you don't yet have the standing to fight it. I also, out of the exact same instinct that made my grandmother keep a shoebox nobody asked her to keep, made and kept my own copy of that entire file before it disappeared into the archive. I didn't connect Coastal Sterling Supply to Sterling Restoration and Roofing until the week after the rehearsal dinner, when curiosity finally got the better of me and I pulled the state business registry, mostly expecting to find nothing at all. Instead, I found that Coastal Sterling Supply had been formed 9 years earlier by a registered agent whose address matched Sterling Restoration's own outside accountant's office. The listed managing member wasn't Margot. It was Denise Cobb, the bookkeeper from the rehearsal dinner, who had worked for Walt Sterling, and then for Margot, for 19 years, without a single break in employment. On my lunch break 2 days before the wedding, in my work clothes with my badge still clipped to my belt, I drove to the county permit office myself, off the clock, and pulled every building permit ever filed for the residential address listed on those old Coastal Sterling Supply invoices. There wasn't a single one. Not one permit, not one inspection, not one contractor of record, for 9 straight years of build materials and labor at that address. I stood at the counter reading the blank search result twice, the way you reread a number that's supposed to be wrong and isn't. The clerk asked if I needed help finding anything else. I told her no, I'd found exactly what I came for. I sat with that discovery for 3 full days before the wedding, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because it wasn't triumph, not even close. It was closer to grief. I was 2 weeks from marrying into this family, and I already suspected the woman about to become my mother-in-law had spent years running a shell vendor quietly through her own company's books, skimming payments for materials and labor that never physically existed, using an employee who'd been loyal to her dead husband to help her do it without ever once questioning it out loud. What I didn't yet know, what I wouldn't understand until the actual night of the wedding, was exactly how far back the pattern went, and what it had already cost this family once before, 6 years earlier, on a scaffold 4 stories above a loading dock. I want to pause the story here and tell you honestly what I did with what I knew, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. I didn't go to Grant with half a theory 2 weeks before our wedding and detonate his entire family in the middle of the best week of his life. I've seen professionally what half-built accusations do to people, and I wasn't going to build one on a hunch, even a well-founded one, even with the wedding bearing down on us. I did 3 specific things. I quietly filed a conflict of interest disclosure at work the same day I confirmed the Sterling connection, formally recusing myself from ever touching another Sterling-adjacent claim for the rest of my career if it came to that, so that whatever I eventually found, nobody could later say I'd used my position improperly to help my own family. I asked a trusted colleague, a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, who I'd worked cases alongside for years and trusted completely, to take an informal, entirely off-the-books look at the public filings for Coastal Sterling Supply, careful the entire time to stay strictly inside what was already a matter of public record. And I pulled my old case file back out one more time and reread every single page, this time looking specifically for anything that connected it, even loosely, to Walt Sterling's death. Priya called me 4 days before the wedding, late on a Tuesday night, and I could hear in her voice before she even said anything that she'd found something real. Coastal Sterling Supply had billed Sterling Restoration and Roofing just under $200,000 a year. Every single year, for 9 straight years, always split across invoices small enough individually to avoid triggering the company's own internal audit threshold. Materials that public delivery records showed were never actually delivered. Labor billed for crews that never appeared on any real job schedule Priya could find. Nearly $1.8 million, quietly bled out of a company grant, had spent his entire life believing was simply, honestly, his family's own. And here's the piece that stopped me cold. Sitting alone in my car outside my own apartment 4 nights before my wedding, engine off, hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 out of pure habit. The shell vendor started billing exactly 6 months before Walt Sterling restructured the company's ownership and quietly wrote that marriage clause into his trust. Not after his suspicions began. Before them, apparently in his own telling to Kareen, and yet somehow perfectly timed to something, which meant, if I had this right, Walt hadn't written that clause out of some vague, generalized caution about the future. He'd written it because he'd already started noticing money leaving his company and couldn't yet prove exactly where it was going. He built a second set of eyes into his own succession plan because some part of him understood he was running out of time to be the first set of eyes himself. I called Odette that night too, past 11, because some decisions I have never once made without her. I told her everything, start to finish, and she listened without interrupting the way she always has, and when I finished she said only one thing. You marry the man, baby. You don't marry the mother. And then you keep every single receipt she ever hands you, because sooner or later, she's going to hand you the one that matters. I didn't sleep much those 4 nights before the wedding. I kept thinking about Kareen's voice on that porch. He died before he finished looking, sweetheart. And I kept thinking about a scaffold, 4 stories up, on a cupola restoration job, and a company ruling of accidental death that nobody with any financial motive to question it ever had a single reason to question at the time. I want to be careful here, because I am not going to tell you I walked into my own wedding holding proof that Walt Sterling was murdered. I didn't have that, Not yet, not close. What I had was a folder full of reasons to eventually ask the question out loud, and a mother-in-law who, in exactly 96 hours, was going to hand me a very unexpected answer of her own, in front of 200 witnesses. The morning of the wedding was bright and almost unbearably beautiful, the kind of October morning Savannah does better than any city I have ever lived in. I got my hair done at Margot's favorite salon, at Margot's own insistence, and she sat beside me for most of it, holding my hand at one point and telling me, with what looked like genuinely real tears standing in her eyes, that she was so glad Grant had finally found someone steady after everything. I remember watching her in that salon mirror and thinking that I genuinely could not tell anymore which version of her was real. I've interviewed enough people who fake sincerity professionally, for money, to know that the very good ones don't feel like acting from the inside, even to themselves. I decided, sitting in that chair with foil in my hair, that it didn't actually matter which version was real. I was going to marry her son regardless of the answer, and I was going to find out the truth about her company regardless of the answer too. Those two facts were simply going to happen on their own separate timelines, whether she liked either one of them or not. The ceremony itself was simple, and honestly, one of the only parts of that entire day that felt completely uncomplicated from start to finish. Grant cried openly when I came down the aisle under the oaks, no attempt at all to hide it, and I cried right back at him. For about 11 minutes, standing across from him with Odette in the front row in her good church dress, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd ironed that morning, none of the rest of it existed at all. I want you to know that part was completely real, whatever else happened a few hours later. The reception tent filled fast after that, 200 guests finding their seats, a 6-piece band tuning up, string lights strung high enough to catch the low-hanging moss and throw soft gold light across everyone's faces. Cocktail hour drifted along easily. I made rounds, thanked people, laughed at the same 3 jokes from at least 6 different relatives, and watched Margot work the room the way she always did, gracious and quick, refilling glasses herself, sometimes instead of waiting for the caterers, which nobody thought twice about, because it looked exactly like generosity. The plan for the evening was simple and traditional: cocktail hour, dinner toasts, and then, before the cake was even cut, the formal signing of the marriage certificate at a small table near the head of the room, witnessed by both sets of parents and the officiant, the way Margot herself had specifically insisted on arranging it. For the photographs, she'd said, weeks earlier, when she was finalizing the reception timeline. I didn't think anything of that particular detail then. I have thought about almost nothing else since. I was crossing the tent during cocktail hour to fix that sideways place card when I caught Margot's hand in the beveled mirror behind the dessert table, tilting the vial over my flute. I want to walk you through the next 90 minutes slowly, because at the time it happened fast, in the way real emergencies always happen fast, and it only made complete sense to me afterward, in pieces, once I'd had time to lay the pieces out in order the way I do at work. I switched the glasses at 6:40. Cocktail hour ended at 7. Dinner service started, and I sat beside Grant making conversation I genuinely don't remember a word of now. While I watched Margot 2 seats down make conversation, I remember with total, almost photographic clarity, because some part of me kept waiting, clock running in my head, for the moment the sedative would start working on her instead of me. It came during her own toast. She stood at 7:40, glass in hand, my glass, the one meant for me, now sitting in front of her because I'd moved it there myself, and began the kind of toast a woman who plans wedding receptions professionally gives easily and warmly, with a gentle joke about Grant's childhood stubbornness, and a line about family that got a soft, appreciative laugh from the whole tent. About 90 seconds into it, she paused mid-sentence like she'd lost her place entirely, started the sentence over, lost it again, this time visibly confused by her own words. Her hand, which had been so perfectly steady over that champagne flute 2 hours earlier, was now trembling openly around the stem of her glass, enough that the band members near the front noticed before most of the guests did. Grant stood up first, alarmed, already reaching for her across the table. I stood a half-second behind him, and I want to tell you honestly that some small, cold, entirely professional part of me was already doing exactly what I do at work, watching, cataloging, noting the time on the wall clock behind the bar without even meaning to. Margot's words slurred badly through the next sentence, something about the flowers that connected to nothing at all. Then, with sudden, strange, piercing clarity that cut straight through the slur, she looked directly at me across the tent full of 200 people and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, she switched them. She switched the glasses. Guests near us went silent instantly. Others farther back kept talking for a few more seconds before the silence spread to them too, the way bad news moves through a crowded room in a wave. Nobody understood what she'd said yet, except me, and I could feel every eye that had heard it swing slowly toward my face. She went down slowly after that, not dramatically, more like her knees simply stopped being informed of the decision to keep holding her up, and Grant caught most of her fall before she hit the grass. Someone screamed. Someone else, thank God, was already dialing before she'd even finished falling. I knelt down beside her in my wedding dress without a single thought for the fabric, took her pulse the way every SIU investigator eventually gets trained to do because you end up at enough real accident scenes to need the skill, and told the paramedics, when they arrived 4 minutes later, exactly what her heart rate and breathing looked like, exactly how long she'd been down, and because I decided, kneeling there on that lawn in white satin, that the truth mattered more than how the truth would look. Exactly what I had watched her do to my own champagne glass 2 hours before any of this started. The paramedics stabilized her on the lawn and took her in for evaluation. The tent went half silent, half roaring, with 200 people trying all at once to process what they had just watched happen at a wedding reception. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Kareen walked straight through the crowd, ignoring at least 4 people trying to stop her and ask what had happened, put both hands firmly on my shoulders, and said, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the noise, "Don't you dare let this stop that certificate from getting signed tonight, Delia. Walt would want it signed. You sign it right now, before anybody talks you out of it." I want to explain why that mattered so much, beyond simple sentiment. I'd spent 4 days doing the math on the trust language Kareen had shown me on her porch weeks earlier. Full audit rights over Sterling Restoration's books would only vest in me, as Grant's legal spouse and co-trustee, the exact moment that certificate was signed and filed. Every hour that certificate went unsigned was another hour Margot, or anyone acting quietly on her behalf, had to keep a second set of books looking clean before someone with legal standing could finally actually open them and look inside. I don't believe, in the moment itself, that Margot consciously calculated all of that the way I'm laying it out for you now, months later, with the benefit of hindsight and a completed investigation. I think, more simply, some old animal part of her recognized that a piece of paper was about to take 20 years of control out of her hands permanently, and some part of her decided the easiest way to stop it was to make sure the bride wasn't steady enough to sign anything at all that night. I'll let you decide for yourself how much of that was carefully planned and how much was pure instinct kicking in under pressure. Either way, the paper had to lose for her plan to succeed. Either way, it didn't. 20 minutes after the ambulance pulled out of the gravel drive, still in my wedding dress, hands shaking now for entirely different reasons than hers had been shaking earlier, I sat down at the small signing table under the string lights with Grant, the efficient, and 2 witnesses, Kareen on one side, and my grandmother Odette on the other, both of them steadying my writing hand without either one saying a single word out loud about why it needed steadying. I signed my name. Grant signed his. The efficient signed after us. It was done, notarized, and witnessed, exactly the way Walt Sterling had written it into his trust 6 years before either Grant or I had any idea his name would ever matter this much to us. Odette leaned over as I capped the pen and said, so soft it was almost just breathe against my ear, "Keep that pen, baby. That's a receipt too. I still have it. It sits in the top drawer of my desk at work." The hospital ran a full toxicology screen on Margot as a standard part of her evaluation, given the sudden collapse and the visible confusion beforehand. The results came back the following afternoon, showing a therapeutic plus dose of a fast-acting sedative in her bloodstream, a compound not listed anywhere among her documented prescriptions, and one she had no legitimate medical reason to be carrying at all, let alone at a wedding reception. Grant told me, sitting in a hospital hallway the day after our wedding, still half in shock in yesterday's rumpled dress shirt, that his mother had first tried, groggy and defensive, to explain the result away as an accidental mix-up with an old prescription from years back. When the hospital toxicologist gently pointed out that the specific compound identified doesn't come in any form remotely resembling anything she claimed to have taken, she stopped explaining anything at all and asked, very quietly, for a lawyer. I visited her myself once, 3 weeks later, at Grant's reluctant request, in a small supervised meeting room arranged through her attorney. I want to tell you about it honestly, because it's the part of this story I've thought about more than almost any other single moment. She looked smaller than I remembered from the wedding, hair undone, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all, just studied my face like she was trying to work out how I'd known. Finally, she said, "You were never supposed to be paying attention that night. Everyone else in this family never pays attention." I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, why she'd done it, not the sedative alone, all of it, 9 years of it. She was quiet for a long time, turning her wedding ring on her own finger, and then she said, "Walt built that company. I kept it standing after he was gone, every single day, and nobody ever once thought to put my name on anything that mattered." I told myself I was only taking what should have already been mine. I asked her gently whether Walt had ever found out. She looked away from me for the first time in that entire conversation and didn't answer. I asked her one last question before the guard signaled the visit was ending. Why the sedative? Why that night? Why me? She finally looked back at me and said, quieter than anything else she'd said the whole visit, "I just needed one more night before it all came apart. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to buy myself a little more time." I didn't say anything back to that. Some answers don't need a response. They just need to be heard and recorded and remembered exactly as they were said. If you're still with me at this point, thank you. This is where I ask you to do one small thing. Subscribe to Paper Trail Justice if you haven't yet, and type the word steady in the comments if you've ever had to keep your own hands steady while the rest of your life was quietly falling apart around you. It helps this channel more than you'd think, and it tells me you're still here for the part of the story that's about to get harder. That's the moment the story stopped being something I had to piece together quietly on my own time and became something entirely official. I filed a formal police report the next morning, along with a full written account of exactly what I'd witnessed in that mirror, and because I'd already recused myself cleanly, on the record. Weeks before any of this became public, I was able to hand the financial piece over to actual sworn law enforcement without a shred of doubt hanging over my own conflict of interest. Priya's informal review became a formal referral. A detective who specializes in financial crimes pulled Coastal Sterling, supplies banking records with a subpoena I had absolutely no hand in obtaining. What they found over the following 6 weeks was worse than either Priya or I had guessed from the outside looking in. Denise Cobb, the bookkeeper, broke almost immediately once detectives sat her down with 9 years of her own invoices spread across the table in front of her. She said Margot had approached her 8 years earlier, not long after Walt's death, and told her the shell vendor was simply how Margot intended to quietly pay herself a fair salary the company's own accountant would never openly approve, framed at first, in Denise's words, as something close to harmless. Denise said she went along with it because Margot had been genuinely kind to her during a rough divorce a decade earlier, and because, in her exact words to the detective, you tell yourself it's small, just this once, and then 10 years go by and it isn't small anymore, and by then you don't know how to stop without losing everything yourself. Nearly $1.8 million. 9 years of falsified invoices, broken down neatly by the forensic accountant law enforcement, eventually brought in to formalize what Priya had already found informally. And when detectives, working the financial thread all the way back to its beginning, pulled the original scene photographs and incident report from Walt Sterling's death and had them reviewed fresh by an independent safety engineer with no connection to the original investigation, they found something the first review 6 years earlier had never once flagged, because nobody back then had any reason to be looking for it. The scaffold clip Walt had been using that day showed where patterns inconsistent with routine, ordinary use. Patterns, the engineer wrote in his formal report, consistent with the clip having been partially loosened by hand at some point before the fall occurred. Nobody has ever proven, and I want to be completely honest with you here, nobody may ever be able to prove conclusively that Walt Sterling's death 6 years ago wasn't the accident it was originally ruled. But the case was formally reopened by the county. And Denise Cobb told detectives one more thing, almost as an afterthought near the end of her interview, that I think about more than almost anything else in this entire story. She said that in the final weeks before Walt died, he'd asked her twice in person for the original delivery manifests for Coastal Sterling Supply, the real ones, the ones that would have shown, in black and white, that nothing had ever actually been delivered. She said she'd stalled him both times, telling him she'd have them pulled by the following week. She said she never got the chance to find out what he would have done once he finally had them in his own hands, because 3 weeks later, he was gone from a fall nobody thought to question. Margot Sterling was charged with felony aggravated battery for the sedative, and separately with financial exploitation of a business entity, theft by deception, and multiple counts of financial identity fraud tied directly to the Shell vendor scheme. Denise Cobb, cooperating fully with prosecutors from the moment she broke, pleaded to a lesser set of charges in exchange for her testimony. As of the last court date I personally attended, the reopened investigation into Walt Sterling's death remains open, officially reclassified now as undetermined rather than accidental, which is its own strange, incomplete kind of justice. Not an answer, not yet, but at least an honest question, finally being asked out loud by people with the actual legal authority to keep asking it. I sat in the back of that courtroom the day the aggravated battery charge was formally read, in a plain gray suit instead of a badge or a wedding dress, and I watched Margot Sterling, who had once told a dressing room full of mirrors that she hoped I'd learn what marriage teaches you, stand at a defense table and say almost nothing at all while her attorney spoke for her. The prosecutor read the toxicology numbers into the record in a flat, procedural voice, the same numbers I'd already memorized from a hospital printout weeks earlier, and somewhere behind me I heard Odette exhale slowly, like she'd been holding that breath since the reception tent. I felt less satisfaction in that moment than I expected to feel. Mostly I just felt tired, and a little bit sad, the particular kind of tired that comes from a truth finally landing exactly where it was always going to land. Eventually, no matter how long somebody manages to hold it off. Grant did not speak to his mother at all for 4 months after the wedding. When he finally did, it was in a supervised legal setting arranged through both attorneys, strictly about the company's transition and nothing else, not about forgiveness. And he told me afterward, quietly in our kitchen, that he didn't think he had any forgiveness in him yet, and that he wasn't going to force it out just to make the story feel neater than it actually was for the sake of anyone watching from the outside. I respected that answer more than almost anything he's ever told me in the time I've known him. Some things simply don't resolve into a clean bow by a certain deadline. I'd rather tell you the true version of this story than the tidy one. What did resolve cleanly, eventually, is the company itself. With the certificate signed and co-trusteeship, legally vested exactly the way Walt had written it 6 years before either of us had any idea his name would come to matter this much. Grant and I spent that entire winter going through Sterling Restoration's complete books together. Page by page, late at night at our own kitchen table, the way Walt himself had apparently meant to before he ran out of time to finish. We found the last remaining threads of what Coastal Sterling Supply had quietly taken over 9 years. We closed the account permanently. We hired an outside controller with absolutely no personal ties to the family to manage the books going forward, on a permanent basis, because I have learned enough in this job to know for certain that trust is a lovely word for a dinner table and a genuinely terrible internal financial control for a company worth millions. Karine came to that first real trustee meeting, entirely unofficial and legally unnecessary by any real standard, and sat quietly in the corner of the office with her hands folded in her lap, listening to every word without saying much of anything herself. Afterward, she pulled a small cedar box out of her handbag and set it down gently on the table in front of me. Inside were 19 years of birthday and Christmas cards Margot had sent her over the decades, each one, in the later years especially, asking with increasing frequency whether Karine had any spare cash to lend, always paid back a little late, always with some small story attached to explain the delay. I kept every single one of these, Karine told me, quiet and steady, because something about the pattern never once sat right with me, and I never had your kind of training to know exactly what to do with a feeling like that. I only ever knew enough to keep the paper, just in case. I told her that's precisely what my own grandmother always used to say to me, word for word almost. Karine just laughed, short and warm, and said Odette Marsh sounds like a woman I would have genuinely liked to know. Here's what I keep coming back to, almost a full year later now, writing all of this down for you. Margot Sterling spent 9 years believing the most dangerous thing in her own son's life was the truth eventually showing up quietly in the mail, in an envelope she could intercept or explain away before he ever opened it himself. She spent a decade managing a shell company with the same careful attention most people reserve for managing a marriage. And in the end, she didn't lose to a courtroom, or to a detective, or even really to me, standing there in my wedding dress with a champagne flute in my hand. She lost to a shoebox of receipts, a cedar box of birthday cards kept out of nothing but a bad feeling, a bookkeeper's conscience finally catching up with 9 years of silence, and a marriage clause her own dead husband wrote into a trust because some quiet, careful part of him already suspected exactly what she was doing, even though he never lived long enough to prove a single word of it himself. I think about Walt Sterling more than I probably should, honestly, for a man I never once met while he was alive. A second set of eyes, Karine called it that first afternoon on her porch, and I've come to believe, doing this work for as long as I have now, that it's the truest possible description of what my entire job actually is. Not catching liars, not really, not at its core. Just being the second set of eyes, somebody else quietly ran out of time to be for themselves. Sterling Restoration and Roofing still restores 140-year-old roof lines across downtown Savannah, one careful joist and one careful slate at a time. Grant runs it now, fully, on his own terms, the way his father and his grandfather always meant for him to eventually. We started something entirely new this past spring, funded partly with restitution money that slowly came back through the court, partly with our own savings, an apprenticeship program for young tradespeople who want to learn historic restoration the honest, patient way, named the Walton Sterling Craft Fellowship in his memory. Karine cut the ribbon herself at 82, refusing anyone's help with the scissors. Odette came in her good church dress again, the same one from the wedding, and told every single new apprentice, one at a time, individually by name, to keep their receipts. Most of them laughed, not quite understanding, yet, why an old woman in a church dress was giving them accounting advice on a construction site. One of them, a 19-year-old named Marcus who'd never held a job longer than 4 months before this one, asked her what she meant by it. Odette just patted his cheek and said, "You'll know exactly what I mean the first time somebody tries to tell you something never happened. Keep the paper, baby." I understood completely. So did Grant. So, I think, would Walt. I still have the pen from the signing table. I keep it in the top drawer of my desk at work, right next to the case file I'm not technically supposed to have kept all these years, and every single time I open a brand new case, I think for a moment about a woman with perfectly steady hands, pouring something into a glass she was absolutely certain nobody in that entire room was watching. Paper doesn't lie, even when people do, again and again for years, until they finally believe their own version of events. Every secret worth hiding badly enough leaves a trail somewhere, on some page, in some drawer, in some cedar box nobody thought mattered at the time. You just have to be patient enough, and steady enough, and stubborn enough to go looking for it, one receipt at a time, for as long as it takes. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. This is paper trail justice, and if you've ever quietly kept the proof while everyone around you insisted you were only imagining things, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me what your own version of the shoebox was, and how long you had to hold onto it before it finally mattered. If tonight's story kept you company, please subscribe and stay with us, because there's always another trail worth following, and I've got a whole folder full of them waiting. Take care of yourselves out there tonight, and keep your receipts.